In a quiet suburban neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, the Clark family seemed to lead an idyllic life. Mark Clark, a 38-year-old corporate executive at a prominent tech company, was known for his charming demeanor and outward success. His wife, Emily, 34, was a dedicated homemaker who had put her career aspirations on hold to raise their two young children, Lily and Owen. Together, they made the perfect couple in the eyes of their friends, family, and neighbors. They had a beautiful home, an impeccable social life, and everything seemed to be in place, but behind closed doors, things were far from perfect. Mark had been hiding a secret from Emily for years, a secret that would unravel their marriage, destroy her trust, and eventually lead to tragedy. Mark's success at his job had come with certain privileges. He was well liked by his colleagues, but one particular person had always taken a special interest in him: his boss, Richard O'Neill. Richard was a successful, well-established executive in the company, known for his ruthless approach to business. But there was a side to Richard that few knew about, one that involved manipulation, control, and an insidious secret affair with Mark. Mark and Richard had met at a company event several years ago, and what started as a professional relationship soon morphed into something darker. At first, it seemed like a typical office bond, with shared late nights and close collaboration on projects. But over time, Richard began to make advances toward Mark. At first, Mark was hesitant, confused by the feelings Richard was stirring in him. But as the months passed, he gave in, and their affair began. Richard was married too, but his wife, Susan, was well aware of her husband's infidelity. She was cold and distant, a product of their own complicated, long-term relationship. Emily, on the other hand, remained completely in the dark about the affair. She trusted Mark, as many spouses do, never imagining that her husband would betray her in such a deep and destructive way. As the affair continued, Mark found himself torn between his loyalty to Emily and his secret life with Richard. The affair was everything Mark had never known he wanted, a mix of power, desire, and a sense of excitement that he couldn't find in his marriage. But all of that came at a cost. The weight of guilt began to gnaw at him, yet he couldn't bring himself to end things with Richard. Their sexual relationship had deepened, and it was no longer just about physical attraction. It had become emotionally entangled in ways that Mark had never expected. Richard manipulated him with promises of more power in the company, and Mark was soon willing to do almost anything to keep the affair going, even as he distanced himself from Emily. But one night, everything changed. It was during a business trip to Chicago, when Mark and Richard took their affair to a hotel room, a place where their relationship had flourished in secret. It was also there that Mark unknowingly crossed a line that would change everything. Richard, like many people living a double life, had his own set of personal risks. Though he presented himself as a sophisticated businessman, his reckless sexual encounters carried consequences. During their affair, Richard contracted HIV, and unbeknownst to Mark, he passed it on to him during one of their encounters. Mark, who had always been somewhat cautious about his health, didn't think much of it at the time, but weeks later, he began feeling ill. At first, it was a mild fever, then came the extreme fatigue. Mark ignored it at first, chalking it up to stress and long hours at work. But when he started noticing swollen lymph nodes and unexplained rashes on his skin, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Mark went to the doctor, convinced that he had contracted some kind of viral infection. After a battery of tests, the doctor confirmed the worst. Mark had contracted HIV. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The virus, which he had unknowingly received from Richard, was now in his bloodstream, a fact that would alter his life forever. Mark's immediate thought was of Emily. How would he ever explain this to her? How could he confess that his betrayal had not only affected their marriage, but also put her life in jeopardy? It was the beginning of a long and painful period of self-loathing and fear for Mark. He had always prided himself on being a good husband and father, but now he was a ticking time bomb. He knew that HIV could take years to show symptoms, but he also knew that he had unknowingly passed the virus on to his wife, who had no idea what had been happening in the shadows of their seemingly perfect life. Mark struggled with how to tell Emily the truth. He couldn't bear to see her face when he confessed, nor could he imagine the pain she would feel knowing that her husband had put her health at risk. And so, he delayed telling her. thinking that maybe, just maybe, it would go away. But the disease didn't wait. Emily, too, began to experience strange symptoms: fatigue, unexplained headaches, and the occasional fever. She brushed it off as stress from running the household and raising their children. Weeks turned into months, and Mark continued to keep the secret. The guilt weighed heavily on him, but the fear of losing his family kept him silent. Eventually, Emily's symptoms grew worse, and one day, she collapsed at home. Panicked, Mark rushed her to the hospital. There, after a series of tests, the doctors confirmed what Emily had been dreading. She, too, had contracted HIV. The news shattered Emily. She couldn't understand how this could have happened. She had always been faithful to Mark, trusted him completely. She had no idea that her husband's reckless actions were the cause of her illness. At first, Emily refused to believe it. She couldn't fathom that Mark, the man she loved and had built a life with, could betray her in such a monstrous way. When Mark finally confessed to the affair, she was left speechless, numb with shock. How could this happen? How could he betray her, their marriage, and their family? And worse yet, how could he have put her life at risk in such a callous, selfish way? The anger that Emily felt was beyond anything she could have imagined. But more than anger, she was consumed by a deep sense of betrayal. She had trusted Mark with everything: her heart, her health, and her future. Now, everything was in jeopardy because of his affair. But Emily wasn't the type of woman to let this slide. She wasn't just going to sit back and accept her fate. As she stewed in her pain and rage, an idea began to form in her mind. This was no longer about HIV or betrayal. This was about justice. The news of Mark's betrayal rocked Emily to her core. She sat in the hospital room, her mind spinning with the enormity of what had just been revealed. The HIV diagnosis, the affair with his boss, the lies. Everything felt like a cruel joke, a betrayal she couldn't comprehend. But as the days passed, Emily's shock slowly transformed into something far darker, an overwhelming sense of rage and desire for retribution. She wasn't the type of woman to be a passive victim, to let her pain define her. No, Emily had always been strong. She had always taken control of her life. And now, in the face of this unimaginable betrayal, she was determined to take control once more, not just of her life, but of Mark's. For days, Emily raged silently, alternating between grief and fury. Her once harmonious home now felt like a prison, the walls closing in on her. Mark, too, was consumed with guilt, but he could see the shift in Emily. The woman who had once adored him now looked at him with cold eyes. No longer a loving wife, but a woman betrayed, her trust shattered. Mark knew the relationship was teetering on the edge. He had hoped that, in time, Emily would forgive him, that he could convince her to move past the affair, to somehow rebuild what they once had. But deep down, he feared she might not be able to. He knew this was no ordinary breach of trust. It was a violation of everything they had built together, and Emily was not one to forgive easily. As weeks passed, Emily's resentment began to fester. She had always been a woman of patience, but now, every moment she spent in Mark's presence felt like an eternity. The anger was no longer just an emotion. It had become her driving force. She began to imagine ways she could make him feel the pain he had caused her. She knew that he had destroyed their family, their future, and her health, but she wasn't going to let him get away with it. If Mark thought he could live with his actions and carry on with his life, he was gravely mistaken. One night, after putting the children to bed, Emily began to research. She had always been a meticulous woman, organized and thorough in everything she did. Her mind, now consumed with thoughts of revenge, was no different. She scoured the internet for information on HIV, on possible legal actions, on revenge, on justice. But it wasn't the legal documents or health information that caught her attention. It was an article about revenge, about people who had been so consumed by betrayal that they had taken matters into their own hands. The article spoke of violent acts, emotional reckoning, and brutal consequences. That's when it clicked. Emily had always been smart. She knew Mark's weaknesses, his pride, his arrogance, and above all, his need to keep up appearances. He would never admit the full extent of his actions to anyone, but Emily knew he would never live down the shame of being caught, and she wasn't going to make it easy for him. If he wasn't going to suffer emotionally, she would make sure he paid physically. 4 days, Emily put her plan into motion. She began secretly gathering supplies, items that would allow her to carry out her revenge without suspicion. She started by purchasing a gun, something she had never imagined she would use, but something she knew would get her point across. It was a Glock 19, purchased from a local firearms dealer, and she made sure everything was done carefully, under the radar. Emily had no intention of getting caught. The next step in her plan was even more chilling. She made sure Mark had no idea what was coming. She pretended to be the loving wife, the devoted mother, all while plotting her next move. She went about her day-to-day tasks, ensuring that nothing seemed amiss. She cooked dinner, took care of the children, and even spent time with Mark, making him believe things were returning to normal. But every word she spoke was laced with venom. Every smile she gave him was a mask, hiding the rage bubbling beneath the surface. On the night of the act, Emily had everything planned. Mark had just returned from work, tired and unaware of what was about to happen. He walked through the front door, greeted by the usual sounds of home, the laughter of their children, the smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen, the soft hum of the television in the background. He thought it would be just another evening, like any other, but Emily had other plans. She met him in the hallway, her face calm, almost serene. Mark, ever the oblivious husband, smiled at her, trying to bridge the gap between them with small talk. He asked how her day had gone, how the kids were, but Emily's responses were cold, mechanical, as if she was speaking to a stranger. "I'm fine," she said, her voice almost emotionless. "Dinner's ready." They sat down to eat, the conversation strained and awkward. Emily watched him closely, observing his every movement. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the guilt he tried so hard to hide. She knew he was waiting for her to break down, to tell him how hurt she was. But Emily had no intention of giving him that satisfaction. She wasn't going to let him play the victim. As dinner progressed, Emily's mind was elsewhere. She wasn't focused on the food, the children, or even Mark. She was thinking about what she had to do. It was now or never. After dinner, Emily suggested that they take a walk. She had been doing a lot of thinking lately, she said, and a walk might clear her mind. Mark agreed, grateful for the break from the tension. They stepped outside, walking down the quiet suburban street as the cool night air brushed against their skin. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement. As they walked, Emily knew the moment had come. She couldn't let him off the hook. She couldn't allow him to get away with it. Mark, oblivious as ever, kept talking about work, about his day. Emily's heart raced as she thought about how far she had come in her plan. There was no turning back now. Then, without warning, Emily turned to him. Her eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth they once shared. Mark stopped walking, sensing the shift in the air, but it was too late. Emily pulled out the gun from the bag she had been carrying. Mark's eyes widened in shock, and for the first time in a long time, he realized the full depth of what he had done. But it was too late for regret, too late for apologies. The betrayal had pushed Emily beyond the point of return. Without a word, Emily pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the night air, and Mark collapsed to the ground, blood staining the concrete. Mark collapsed to the ground, his body crumpling like a rag doll, blood pooling around him in the shadows. Emily stood over him, her heart pounding in her chest, the gun still clutched tightly in her hand. The weight of what she had just done hit her like a tidal wave, but there was no turning back now. Mark's life ended in a few brutal seconds, but Emily's emotions remained tangled. Rage, pain, relief, and an unsettling sense of power. As she stood there, staring down at the body of the man she had once loved, something inside her began to unravel. What had she become? She had taken his life, but would it bring her the closure she so desperately sought? For several moments, Emily was frozen, the stillness of the night pressing in on her. Then, slowly, she turned and walked back to the house. She cleaned up the gun, tucked it away, and then went upstairs to the children's rooms, her hands shaking. She kissed them both on the forehead as they slept soundly, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded just outside. The police were called the next morning by a neighbor who had heard a gunshot but hadn't thought much of it at the time. When they arrived at the house, Emily acted the part of the grieving widow. She played the role perfectly, her tears falling as she recounted how Mark had come home late, how they had fought about his affair, and how, in the midst of their argument, he had taken his own life. But the detectives were skeptical. Emily's behavior didn't quite match her story, and a few inconsistencies in her account raised suspicion. It wasn't long before the police began digging deeper into the couple's history, uncovering the affair, the HIV diagnosis, and Emily's growing resentment toward Mark. The pieces began to fall into place, and the investigation shifted course. Emily was arrested and charged with murder. Her trial began just months after the crime, and the entire community was divided. Some people saw her as a victim of a broken marriage, driven to desperation by her husband's betrayal and her health diagnosis. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who had taken the law into her own hands to exact brutal revenge. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who, while deeply hurt, had made a deliberate choice to end her husband's life. They argued that Emily had planned the murder carefully, that she had concealed her emotions and executed the act with cold precision. The defense, on the other hand, tried to humanize her, showing how she had been manipulated and deceived by Mark, how the affair and her HIV diagnosis had shattered her world. They contended that Emily had been overwhelmed by rage and confusion, a victim of her circumstances, and that her actions had been a moment of uncontrollable fury rather than premeditation. Emily's emotional state was a key point in the trial. Experts testified that the betrayal and the subsequent HIV diagnosis had likely triggered a mental breakdown. She had loved Mark, and in one tragic moment of emotional collapse, she made a devastating decision. The defense argued that Emily was not the monster the prosecution depicted her to be, but a woman who had lost everything and acted out of desperation. But despite the emotional turmoil and the attempt at portraying her as a victim of circumstance, the jury found Emily guilty of second-degree murder. They acknowledged that while her actions were driven by rage, there was enough evidence to suggest that she had premeditated the crime. Emily was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. In the years that followed, Emily spent her time in prison reflecting on her actions. The guilt never fully left her. She thought often of the family she had destroyed, Mark, her children, the life they had built. She knew that nothing could ever undo the damage, the pain, and the lives ruined in the wake of that single, fateful moment. She had taken Mark's life, but in doing so, she had also sentenced herself to a life of emptiness. As for Mark's family, they were devastated by his death. His parents, siblings, and friends were left to grapple with the fact that their loved one had been the victim of his own betrayals. The revelation of the affair and the deadly consequences tore apart their family. And for Mark's parents, the grief was compounded by the knowledge that their son had created a life of secrets and lies that ultimately led to his death. Emily's children grew up without their mother. The trauma they experienced in the wake of their father's murder and their mother's imprisonment would leave lasting scars on them both. They struggled with feelings of abandonment and anger, unsure of how to process the loss of both parents in such tragic and violent circumstances.